I am presenting Union Gospel Press's Sunday School Lesson number 7, Sunday, July 18th, 2021. The lesson is entitled Nehemiah Combats Derision and Danger. Lesson text comes from Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. Related scriptures are Nehemiah 2, 9 through 20, and 6, 1 through 15. Psalms 123, 1 through 4. 1 Peter 5, 6 through 10. The place is Jerusalem. The time is 445 BC. One of Satan's most frequently employed weapons against Christians is ridicule. No one, including followers of Christ, enjoys being ridiculed by other people. Even the threat of being publicly mocked for speaking up for Christ causes some to never let their voice be heard. Rather than allowing themselves to be the object of another person's scorn, they simply stay quiet to avoid any problems. We who follow Christ must understand that the world we are proclaiming the gospel to does not want to hear it. We have a message that is in conflict with their sinful desires, and they do not want to listen to anyone tell them they need to repent. In order to silence anyone who would tell them they need to seek forgiveness, they will often resort to name-calling and even character assassination. As we will learn in this week's lesson, however, we must be strong and stand firm even when people laugh at us. Today's aim, facts. To realize that those who speak up for the Lord will be ridiculed by others. Principle. To show that God will bless and empower those who absorb the ridicule of the enemy. Application. To determine to seek the applause of heaven rather than the accolades of man. Illustrating the lesson. No tactic used by Satan can tear down the wall of faith that surrounds those who trust the Lord. Practical points. 1. God's people can expect opposition when they are doing God's work. Nehemiah 4:1. 2. God's enemies underestimate his power and the strength of his love for his people. Verse 2. 3. The best way to respond to threats is always with prayer. Verses 3 through 5. 4. United perseverance in God's work fights off the discouragement of enemies seek to sow. Verse 6. 5. Threats, confusion, and discord are tools Satan uses to hinder God's work. Verses 7 through 8. 6. We defeat the devil's plans when we stay connected to God in prayer and stay alert to the enemy's schemes. Verse 9. Golden text. Nevertheless, we made our prayer unto our God and set a watch against them day and night because of them. Nehemiah 4:9. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is enemy mockery, coming from Nehemiah 4:1 through 3. The second is prayer and perseverance, Nehemiah 4:4 through 6. The third is enemy threats and more prayer, Nehemiah 4:7 through 9. Introduction. Nobody likes being made fun of. It hurts immensely to be made the butt of other people's jokes. This is especially true when the people make the taunts are bullies against whom the person being mocked feels powerless and helpless. We cannot hurl any choice insults in response. He just has to stand there and take it. Perhaps worse than simply bullying is the disheartening low that comes when a special effort or creation becomes the subject of ridicule. It can make even a strong person give up. We can feel the same way when our efforts to serve the Lord are similarly maligned. Few things sap the will to continue as do ongoing scorn and mockery. But Nehemiah gives us one key to beating back the abuse: steadfast prayer and faith in God's ultimate vindication. We can persevere and leave the results with him. Enemy mockery. Nehemiah 4:1. But it came to pass that when Sanballat heard that we builded the wall, he was wroth and took great indignation and mocked the Jews. Verse 2. And he spake before his brethren and the army of Samaria, and said, What do these feeble Jews? Will they fortify themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they make an end in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of the rubbish which are burned? Verse 2. Now Tobiah the Amorite was by him, and he said, Even that which they build, if a fox go up it, he shall even break down their stone wall. With this lesson, we jump ahead several hundred years and land in the period that followed Judah's 70-year exile in Babylon. In fact, we find ourselves at a point nearly a century after the first group of returnees from Babylon arrived back in Jerusalem. That happened according to accepted reckoning in 536 BC under the leadership of Zerubbabel. After a rough start, the Jews managed to rebuild the temple, Ezra 3:1 through 6:15, and much of the city. Jerusalem's walls, however, still lay largely in ruins. It was this sad fact that greatly distressed Nehemiah when it came to his attention during a visit by a delegation from Jerusalem, Nehemiah 1:1 through 4. Nehemiah was serving at the time as the chief cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes, to 1:11 through 2:1, who ruled from the fortress city of Shushan, also known as Suah. Shushan was located to the east of Babylon in what is now Iran. The position of cupbearer was one of great honor and responsibility, and the bad news from Jerusalem created an awkward situation for Nehemiah. Nevertheless, he obtained permission from the king to lead a fully authorized support mission to the Judean capital. Nehemiah's aim was to build the city's broken down wall and repair its defenses and prestige, 2:1 through 7. 3 days after Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem, he conducted a secret nighttime reconnaissance mission to get an accurate sense of the situation, verses 11 through 15. It was indeed grim and might have discouraged a less stalwart leader from attempting anything significant, as was evidently the case with the Jerusalem authorities. But Nehemiah was a man of faith and vision. Where others saw insurmountable rubble, he saw restoration under God's leading and power. Nehemiah convened a gathering of the city's religious and political leaders and shared his vision of rebuilding, verses 16 through 18. A city without an intact wall would not only lay defenseless before its enemies, it would also bear shame and disgrace in the eyes of its neighbors. This was not an acceptable state of affairs for a city that represented the true God in a world of idolatry and paganism. Nehemiah's urging rattled the leaders and people of Jerusalem, and soon the hard work of repair began. Strong opposition, however, arose almost immediately. Outrage, shock. Nehemiah 4:1 through 2. We first met Sanballat in chapter 2. He is called the Horonite, verse 10, and apparently was the leader of an influential ethnic group in the region of Judea. He is also mentioned in tandem with Tobiah the Ammonite and Geshem the Arabian, 2:19, 4:7, 6:1. Together, these leaders and their peoples constituted a formidable force that rose up in opposition against Nehemiah and the Jews. Sanballat and his allies had scoffed at the plan to rebuild when they first heard of it, 2:19. Imagining that the efforts would quickly amount to nothing, but now that actual progress had been made, extensive details are given in chapter 3. He reacted in shock and indignation. He was wroth, 4:1, and he launched a tirade of mockery. Sanballat carried out his rant in the presence of his brethren and the army of Samaria, verse 2. This is most likely a reference to close friends and allies, including a number of Samaritan army officers. These were people he did not need to convince. So what we see described here as an episode of scorn-laden venting. We can practically see Sanballat pacing back and forth, crying out in frustration. Just what do these feeble Jews think they are up to? Do they really imagine they can rebuild their defenses? Do they think offering their sacrifices will help? Do they expect to finish it in a day? Sanballat was incredulous that such a task was being accomplished. He scornfully pointed out all the charged stones in the rubble and wondered aloud if the Jews would try to reuse them. The whole thing seemed absurd, and it was making him angry. Unbridled sarcasm, Nehemiah 4:3. Sanballat's associate Tobiah the Amorite was at his side and now chimed in with some choice ridicule of his own. He may have been trying to calm down his agitated friend, for he employed what he no doubt saw as a bit of shrewdly pointed humor. Tobiah voiced his considered opinion that he knew that the new wall the Jews were building was so fragile that even a fox could knock it down just by walking on it. We are not told how the others present reacted, but they no doubt shared the derisive opinion. More significantly, the sarcastic appraisal evidently reached the ears of the Jews and Nehemiah. This undoubtedly was by design, intended as a way of discouraging the workers and derailing the rebuilding program. But because God had a faithful man in charge, the mockery had exactly the opposite effect. Prayer and perseverance. Verse 4. Hear, O our God, for we are despised, and turn their reproach upon their own head, and give them for a prey in the land of captivity. Verse 5. And cover not their iniquity, and let not their sin be blotted out from before thee, for they have reproved thee to anger before the builders. Verse 6. So build we the wall, and all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof, for the people had a mind to work. Prayer for vindication, Nehemiah 4:4-5. It is interesting to speculate on what the response to God's people might have been like in today's terms. If Nehemiah had had a Twitter account, he might have shot back with an inflammatory tweet of his own. Even in his day, he could have sent a scathing message back to Sanballat by courier. He could have gripped about it at length with his companions and friends. Maybe he did a little bit, but no such mention is made in the text. Instead, Nehemiah took the matter to God. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Verse 4. Some English translations add, and us after here, but it seems more likely Nehemiah was saying something like, God, do you hear what they're saying about us? This was not a placid, lofty prayer intoned in hushed, reverential calm. Nehemiah was upset. He was agitated. He had a right to be angry, and he did exactly right in not hiding it from the Lord, but voicing it honestly before him. Nehemiah launched directly into his complaint. We are despised, he was telling God. They're mocking us. He hated it that all the hard work his people had put in up to this point was being made the butt of a scornful joke. They deserved better. And so that is exactly what Nehemiah requested. Turn their reproach upon their own head. The Hebrew for reproach is stronger than what the English word might convey. Nehemiah wanted his adversaries scorned, their taunts to boomerang back on them. He strengthened his thought by adding the request that the taunters would become captives in a foreign land themselves. In the land of captivity does not specify a particular country. Nehemiah nearly wished that the mockers would get a taste of the captivity that his own people had endured not so long before. Then everyone would see how well they managed afterward. It would be a just punishment. The one thing Nehemiah did not want was to see the mockers' actions get swept under the rug and ignored. This is brought out forcefully in the plea, cover not their iniquity. Let wickedness Their wickedness needed to be exposed, brought out into the light, and dealt with. Nehemiah emphasized the point by asking God not to blot out their sins from before him. In other words, he pleaded, don't let them get away with this. We fully sympathize with Nehemiah's frustration. But was he right to utter such a prayer that sounds so uncharitable? For those of us familiar with Jesus' teaching to love our enemies and to pray for them which despitefully use us, Matthew 5:44. It can seem improper or unspiritual to pray against forgiveness for others. When someone does us wrong, and that would include mocking us, we know that we are to forgive him or her and pray that God will bring repentance and restoration to that person. Why did Nehemiah not follow such a pattern? This question, of course, arises every time we see an imprecatory prayer in the Old Testament. And there are a lot of them. Please that God would bring people's evil back on their own heads. Please that he would deal with them as they deserve. Some of these prayers are positively blood-curdling in their wording. Nehemiah's is actually quite tame in comparison. Before going too far, however, it should be noted that such prayers are not absent from the New Testament. Galatians 1:8-9, 2 Timothy 4:14, and Revelation 6:10 are just a few examples. We need to briefly consider the godly purpose behind such requests. First, Nehemiah was asking for immediate help in a difficult situation. The hard-wearing work of rebuilding was in danger of coming to a halt if the enemy's taunts were allowed to sap the people's morale. Second, the taunts of Sanballat and company were not harmless fun. They contained implicit threats. Nehemiah recognized the peril and called on God to turn it back on them. Finally, the mocking did not merely make fun of the people's efforts, it impugned the honor of God. In asking for God to deal with it, Nehemiah was praying for God's glory to be upheld. Nehemiah's confidence that God would fight for the honor of his name is seen in his conclusion. They have provoked thee to anger before the builders, Nehemiah 4:5. The assault on the rebuilding effort was an assault on God's honor. Those hard at work would sense this, and so for their sake Nehemiah asked the Lord to intervene confident that he would. Progress on the wall, Nehemiah 4:6. Nehemiah's prayer was answered in the most telling way. The work went on, proving the emptiness of the enemy's taunts. The entire wall around the city was joined together, that is, linked up in a unified structure unto the half thereof. That somewhat puzzling phrase is simply telling us that the builders had managed to restore the entire wall to half its original height. They still had a lot of work ahead of them, but they had made incredible progress in an astonishingly short amount of time. Enemy threats and more prayer. Verse 7. But it came to pass that when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabians and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up and that the breaches began to be stopped, they then were very wroth. Verse 8. And conspired all of them together to come and to fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it. Verse 9. Nevertheless, we made our prayer unto our God and set a watch against them day and night because of them. Rage and plotting, Nehemiah 4:7-8. Not surprisingly, when Sanballat and his cronies heard that the building was going ahead, despite their taunts and the gaps were being systematically filled in, they were furious. The time for more mockery was over. Now they were going to have to do something about it. The enemies made plans together to march on Jerusalem and stop the rebuilding effort by force. They would do anything they could to hinder the work and spread fear and confusion among the workers and their leaders. It was not an idle threat. Prayer and watchfulness, Nehemiah 4:9. The response of Nehemiah and his people to this new threat is wonderful in its simplicity. Nevertheless, we made our prayer unto our God. When news came to them of their enemies' designs, they did not panic or react in anger themselves. They simply brought the matter back to God, fully depending on Him to take note of the threats and deal with them. Yet their dependence on God did not allow them to be lackadaisical or neglectful of their own responsibilities. From this point on, they set a watch, that is, posted a 24-hour guard against any enemy activity. This was exactly the precaution they needed to take. Not only would the watch provide protection, but it would also maintain the morale and confidence of the wall builders. They would see that they were not being sent out defenseless to do the work. Our text ends here, leaving us hanging somewhat as to the final outcome. But there is no doubt that the rebuilding would go on. Problems would be faced and overcome. 4:10 through 5:13. The enemies would attempt diplomatic treachery and blackmail. 6:1 through 7, and even assassination. Verse 10. But the work would not be stopped. 52 days after the whole effort had begun, the wall was finished. Verse 15. It was a mighty work of God. Verse 16. And even the enemies realized it and were amazed. We too should be amazed, even so far removed in time. But the lesson for us is to consider what work God has called us to. It may not be appreciated by others, but when we approach it with prayer and perseverance, we can be confident He will finish that work as well, to His glory and the confounding of His enemies. Questions. 1. What three leaders allied against Nehemiah? 2. What made Sanballat react in anger? 3. What sarcastic opinion did Tobiah voice about Jerusalem's wall? 4. What did Nehemiah do when he heard of the mockery? 5. What did Nehemiah want God to do with the enemy's taunts? 6. What did he not want God to do? 7. How was Nehemiah's prayer answered? 8. How did the enemies react to the continual progress in rebuilding? 9. How did Nehemiah and his people react to the new threat? 10. What additional step did they take after praying? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, July 18th, 2021. Thank you for listening. God bless.